The closing documents felt heavy in my hands, heavier than they should. It was supposed to be a celebration. Our dream house, 5 bedrooms, a huge garden for the dogs, a chef's kitchen I'd been drooling over for years, 10 years of marriage to Mark, 10 years of scrimping and saving, and finally, here we were, ready to sign our lives away. Mark chuckled, his hand covering mine. He looked genuinely happy. Or so I thought. I forced a smile. More like signing into paradise, I replied, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't about the house itself, it was Mark. He'd been distant lately, working late, always on his phone, the light in his eyes flickering out when he looked at me. But I chalked it up to stress. This house was a huge undertaking. The lawyer droned on, pointing out clauses I barely understood. My eyes glazed over. Mark nudged me, pointing to where I needed to initial. I did, blindly trusting him, trusting us. "This is a formality, honey," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "Just transferring everything into a joint trust. Makes things easier down the line, for the kids. When we have them, the kids. We'd been talking about kids for years. It was always someday, soon, when we're more settled. The house felt like the perfect settled. Hearing him say it now, so casually, should have filled me with joy. Instead, it felt hollow. I signed the final document with a flourish, the ink a dark, foreboding blot against the pristine white paper. We celebrated that night with champagne and takeout pizza, sitting on the bare floor of our new living room, surrounded by boxes. It felt surreal. This was it, the start of our forever. But forever, as I was about to learn, had a twisted sense of humor. The first few months were a blur of unpacking, decorating, and trying to make the house a home. Mark was helpful in a superficial way. He hung pictures, moved furniture, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere. The late nights at the office became more frequent, his excuses more elaborate. Then came the phone call, an anonymous voice crackling with static. "He's seeing someone else. Her name is Sarah. Check his phone." My first reaction was disbelief. Pure, unadulterated disbelief. Mark? Cheating? It was impossible. He wasn't the type. He was steady, reliable, predictable. But the seed of doubt had been planted. It burrowed deep, sending its roots into the fertile ground of my insecurities. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. The way he flinched when I touched him. The secretive smiles he exchanged with his phone. The faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine lingering on his clothes. I couldn't confront him without proof. I needed to know. For my own sanity. His phone was always locked. He took it everywhere, even to the bathroom. It was like Fort Knox, guarding secrets I desperately needed to uncover. One night, he fell asleep on the couch, the TV still blaring. He'd had a long day at work, or so he said. His phone lay face down on the coffee table, vibrating silently. My heart pounded against my ribs. This was my chance. I crept closer, my hand trembling as I reached for it. I knew his passcode, our anniversary date. It had always been our anniversary date. I typed it in. The screen unlocked. My breath hitched. There it was. A text message. From Sarah Love. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow night. Miss you already." The world tilted on its axis. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. It was real. It was happening. The man I loved, the man I'd built a life with, was betraying me. I scrolled through the messages. They were explicit, intimate, filled with promises of a future that wasn't supposed to include me. I felt a surge of rage, so intense it threatened to consume me. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone against the wall, to wake him up and demand answers. But I didn't. I carefully placed the phone back on the table, my mind already racing. I needed a plan. I wouldn't let him get away with this. The next few days were a carefully orchestrated performance. I acted normal, pretended I didn't know. I made him dinner, smiled, even laughed at his stupid jokes. Inside, I was a volcano, simmering with anger and betrayal. I started digging. I needed to know who this Sarah was, what she looked like, what Mark saw in her. I became a digital detective, scouring social media, running background checks. It wasn't hard to find her. Sarah Jenkins, early 30s, blonde, beautiful, a real estate agent. My stomach churned, and then I found it. A picture on her Instagram. Her and Mark, holding hands, at a restaurant I recognized. It was down the street from his office. The caption read, "My love." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It was official. He wasn't just having an affair, he was in love. But there was something else in the picture, something that caught my eye. In the background, reflected in a window, was a building I recognized. The law firm where we'd signed the closing documents for our house. A wave of suspicion washed over me. Why would Mark be meeting his mistress at a restaurant across the street from our lawyer's office? It didn't make sense. I decided to pay the lawyer a visit. I told Mark one was going shopping with a friend, packed a bag with some old documents, and drove downtown. The receptionist, a woman with tired eyes and a sympathetic smile, buzzed me in. "Mr. Henderson, our lawyer, greeted me with a handshake. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice smooth and professional. "I just had a few questions about the closing documents," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm a little confused about the joint trust." He pulled up the file on his computer. "Of course. Happy to clarify. It's a fairly standard procedure. You and Mr. Thompson are both listed as trustees, with equal access and control." "Equal access?" I asked, my heart pounding. "So, if I wanted to, I could sell the house without his consent?" He hesitated. "Well, technically, yes. But it's highly unlikely you'd want to do that. It's a marital asset, but could I?" I pressed. He sighed. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson, you could." I showed him a copy of the deed I had brought along. "Can you explain this document to me in detail? Specifically, the part about the transfer of ownership." He looked at the copy, then back at me, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, it seems there's been a slight misunderstanding." He swiveled his computer screen so I could see it. There it was, in black and white. The house! The deed. My name? And then, in smaller print, the words, "Transfer of ownership to Mark Thompson." My blood ran cold. What does this mean?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. He cleared his throat. "It means, Mrs. Thompson, that you signed over full ownership of the house to your husband. You are no longer on the deed." The room started to spin. The world went blurry. I felt like I was falling into a bottomless pit of betrayal. He'd tricked me. He'd planned this all along. He'd gotten me to sign away my most valuable asset, the roof over my head, so he could. What? Run off with his mistress? "But the joint trust," I choked out. "He said it was for a joint trust." Mr. Henderson shook his head. "There is no joint trust, Mrs. Thompson." "I'm very sorry." My mind raced. The late nights at work, the phone calls, the excuses, it all clicked into place. He wasn't working late. He was plotting. He wasn't stressed. He was elated. He was getting away with it. Or so he thought. I need to go." I stood up, feeling numb, robotic. I thanked Mr. Henderson, mumbled something about needing to process the information, and stumbled out of the office. As I walked to my car, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with brutal force. The restaurant across from the lawyer's office, Sarah, the real estate agent, the formality of signing the documents. He wasn't just having an affair, he was planning to leave me, and he was going to leave me with nothing. But he underestimated me. He thought I was naive, trusting, easily manipulated. He thought I would just roll over and accept my fate. He was wrong. Little did he know, he had just awakened a sleeping giant. I drove home, the familiar streets blurring into an indistinguishable mess. I parked the car in the driveway, walked into the house, and saw Mark sitting on the couch, watching TV. He looked up, smiled. "Hey, honey! How was shopping?" I forced a smile back. "Fine," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside me. "I just need to lie down for a bit. I have a headache." I went upstairs to our bedroom, closed the door, and locked it. I leaned against the door, my body trembling. I needed to think. I needed a plan. I needed to figure out how to take back what was rightfully mine. I couldn't confront him yet. Not until I had all my ducks in a row. He was a skilled manipulator. He would deny everything, twist the truth, make me feel like I was crazy. I needed to play him at his own game. I spent the next few days researching. I learned everything I could about property law, divorce law, fraud. I contacted a lawyer, a different lawyer, one recommended by a trusted friend. I explained my situation, showed him the documents. He was outraged. "This is blatant fraud, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "We can fight this. We can get your house back. But we need to be smart. We need to gather evidence. And we need to catch him off guard." He advised me not to confront Mark, to continue acting normal, to gather as much evidence as possible. He suggested I record conversations, document expenses, and keep track of Mark's movements. And so, the game began. I started recording every conversation I had with Mark. I hid a small voice recorder in my purse, turning it on whenever he was around. It felt dirty, dishonest, but I knew it was necessary. I also started documenting every expense. I kept receipts, tracked bank statements, and made copies of everything. I needed to prove that I had contributed significantly to the purchase and upkeep of the house. And I started tracking Mark's movements. I followed him after work, watched him meet Sarah at restaurants, coffee shops, even hotels. It was excruciating seeing them together, seeing him smile at her the way he used to smile at me, but I gritted my teeth and kept going. I discovered that he had opened a separate bank account, an account I knew nothing about. He was transferring large sums of money into it, money that was rightfully mine. I also found evidence that he had been lying about his work trips. He wasn't going to conferences. He was spending romantic weekends with Sarah. The more I learned, the angrier I became. But I kept my anger hidden, buried deep inside. I knew that if I lost control, I would ruin everything. I became a master of disguise, a chameleon blending into the background. I smiled, laughed, and pretended to be the same naive, trusting woman Mark thought I was. But inside, I was plotting my revenge. The day arrived when I felt like I had enough evidence. My lawyer agreed. It was time to confront Mark. I had planned the confrontation meticulously. I had rehearsed what I was going to say, how I was going to say it. I had imagined his reaction, his lies, his denials. I waited for him to come home from work, my heart pounding in my chest. When he walked through the door, I took a deep breath and said, "We need to talk." He looked at me, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I know about Sarah," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I know about the affair. I know about the secret bank account. And I know about the house." His face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. "Don't even bother lying," I said. "I have proof. I have everything. The texts, the pictures, the bank statements, the documents. I know you tricked me into signing over the house. I know you were planning to leave me with nothing." He looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. I can explain," he stammered. "Explain what?" I said, my voice rising. "Explain how you could betray me like this? Explain how you could lie to me for so long? Explain how you could be so cruel?" He started to cry, real tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he sobbed. "It just happened. I still love you. Please, give me another chance." I stared at him, my heart filled with disgust. How could he expect me to believe him? How could he think I would ever forgive him? "It's over, Mark," I said, my voice cold and hard. "I want you out of this house. I want a divorce, and I want my house back." He begged, pleaded, promised to change. But I was unmoved. The man I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a lying, cheating, manipulative stranger. I had finally confronted him. I had finally told him the truth. I had finally taken control of my own life. Or so I thought. Just as I was about to deliver the final blow, the phone rang. It was my lawyer. "Don't confront him," he said urgently. "I just uncovered something big. It changes everything. Meet me at my office now." My blood ran cold. What could be so important that it would change everything? I have to go," I said to Mark, my voice shaky. "I'll be back later." I grabbed my purse and ran out of the house, leaving Mark sobbing on the couch. I had no idea what was waiting for me at my lawyer's office, but I knew deep down that it was going to be devastating. I raced to my lawyer's office, my mind reeling. What could he have possibly found that was so earth-shattering? Was it something about Sarah? Something about Mark's finances? Or something else entirely? He was waiting for me when I arrived, his face grim. He ushered me into his office and closed the door. "I have some information that I think you need to hear," he said, his voice grave. "It's about the house." My stomach clenched. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He took a deep breath. I was doing some digging into the history of the property, and I uncovered something unexpected. It turns out that the land your house is built on used to belong to a company. That company was called Apex Industries. Apex Industries? The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. "And?" I prompted. He hesitated. Apex Industries was involved in some questionable activities. There were allegations of environmental contamination, unsafe disposal of waste materials that led to severe health problems for the people living in the vicinity of the location of where their factory used to be. "There are records of soil samples being tested from around the house. You mean our house could be contaminated?" My lawyer nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. I've already arranged for an independent environmental assessment. They should be able to tell us the extent of the contamination and what needs to be done to fix it." I felt like I was going to be sick. The house, our dream house, it wasn't just a symbol of our failing marriage. It was a potential death trap. But Mark knew about this, didn't he? My lawyer nodded. "I believe so. I found evidence that he had hired a private investigator to look into the history of the property before you even started looking at the house. So, not only had he cheated on me and tricked me into signing away my house, he had knowingly put my health, and potentially my life, at risk." The rage that had been simmering inside me finally boiled over. I wanted to destroy something, anything. I wanted to make Mark pay for what he had done. "I can't believe this," I said, my voice shaking with fury. He knew, and he didn't tell me. He let me move into a contaminated house. He's trying to kill me. My lawyer looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. "We need to be careful, Mistress Thompson. If he knew about the contamination and didn't disclose it, that's a serious crime. But we need to prove it." "I'll prove it," I said, my voice hard. "I'll make him regret the day he ever met me." I knew I couldn't let Mark suspect that I knew about the contamination. I needed to play along, act normal, and gather as much evidence as possible. When I got back to the house, Mark was still on the couch, sobbing. I ignored him and went upstairs to our bedroom. I needed to clear my head and think. I decided to focus on finding the private investigator. I needed to know what Mark had asked him to do, what information he had uncovered, and whether he had shared that information with Mark. I started by searching Mark's computer. I knew he wasn't very tech-savvy, so I figured there was a good chance he had left some clues behind. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. In his email history, there was a series of messages between Mark and a private investigator named John Davis. The emails were brief, but they were enough to confirm my suspicions. Mark had hired John Davis to investigate the history of the property. He had specifically asked him to look for any information about environmental contamination. There was also an attachment, a report from John Davis detailing his findings. The report confirmed that the land had indeed been contaminated by Apex Industries and that there was a risk of exposure to harmful chemicals. Mark had known all along. He had deliberately concealed this information from me. He had put my health at risk, all for the sake of his own selfish desires. I felt a surge of hatred so intense it was almost blinding. I wanted to hurt him, to make him suffer the way he had made me suffer. But I knew that revenge wouldn't bring me happiness. It wouldn't undo the damage he had done. What I needed was justice. I contacted John Davis. I told him that I was Mark's wife and that I knew about the investigation he had conducted. I asked him to meet with me. He was reluctant at first, but I convinced him that it was the right thing to do. I told him that Mark had put my life at risk and that I needed his help to bring him to justice. We met at a coffee shop. John Davis was a middle-aged man with a weary expression. He seemed genuinely remorseful for his role in Mark's scheme. He confirmed everything that I already knew. He told me that Mark had been very specific about what he wanted him to investigate, and that he had paid him a significant amount of money to keep the information confidential. He also gave me something that I didn't expect, a recording of a phone conversation between him and Mark. In the conversation, Mark explicitly stated that he was aware of the contamination and that he didn't care about the health risks. He said that he was willing to take the risk because he wanted the house, and he didn't want me to find out about the affair. I had my smoking gun. With the evidence piling up, my lawyer advised me to file a police report and a lawsuit. The police were initially skeptical, but the recording of Mark's conversation with the private investigator convinced them that there was a case. The lawsuit was for fraud, breach of contract, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We were seeking to have the house deed reversed, as well as compensatory and punitive damages. But I wasn't satisfied with just a lawsuit and a police report. I wanted to make Mark suffer in a way that he would never forget. I wanted to expose him for the lying, cheating, manipulative monster that he was. I decided to set a trap for him. I knew that he was still seeing Sarah. I also knew that he was planning to leave me as soon as he could get away with it. I decided to use that to my advantage. I started acting like I was willing to forgive him. I told him that I was willing to give our marriage another chance. I even suggested that we go to couples therapy. He was overjoyed. He believed that he had gotten away with everything, and that he could still have his cake and eat it too. I told him that I wanted to celebrate our reconciliation with a romantic weekend getaway. I suggested that we go to a luxurious spa resort in the mountains. He jumped at the chance. He was so eager to please me, so desperate to regain my trust, that he didn't suspect a thing. I booked the resort and made all the arrangements. But I had a secret plan. I contacted Sarah and told her everything. I told her about the affair, the house, the contamination, and Mark's plans to leave me. She was shocked and horrified. She had no idea that Mark was married or that the house was contaminated. She had believed his lies and his promises. I told her that I wanted her to help me expose Mark. I wanted her to join me at the resort and confront him in front of everyone. She agreed. She was angry and betrayed, and she wanted revenge just as much as I did. The day of the getaway arrived. I packed my bags, pretending to be excited about spending a romantic weekend with Mark. He was beaming as he loaded our luggage into the car. He thought he was about to embark on a weekend of passion and reconciliation. Little did he know he was walking into a trap. The resort was beautiful, nestled in the heart of the mountains. The air was crisp and clean, and the scenery was breathtaking. We checked into our suite, which was lavishly decorated and had a stunning view. Mark immediately started making romantic overtures, but I brushed him off. I told him that I wanted to relax and unwind. I had arranged for Sarah to arrive later that evening. She was going to check into a room under a different name and wait for my signal. As soon as we were settled in, I texted Sarah. "It's time," I wrote. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Mark answered it, expecting to see room service. Instead, he was greeted by Sarah, his face drained of color. He stared at her, speechless. "What are you doing here?" he finally stammered. "I think you know why I'm here, Mark," Sarah said, her voice cold and hard. "I came to find out why you lied to me and kept me in the dark. How could you not tell me you are married and that you had me helping you defraud your wife?" "Sarah, please," Mark pleaded. "This isn't what it looks like." "Oh, I think it is exactly what it looks like," Sarah said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're a liar and a cheat. You used me. You betrayed me." Mark turned to me, his eyes filled with panic. "Honey, please believe me. I can explain." "Explain what, Mark?" I said, my voice dripping with venom. "Explain how you could betray me like this? Explain how you could lie to me for so long? Explain how you could be so cruel?" I stepped aside, revealing a group of people standing behind me. They were reporters, photographers, and camera crew. "I think the world deserves to hear your explanation, Mark," I said, my voice ringing with triumph. "Tell them how you cheated on me, tricked me into signing over my house, and knowingly exposed me to toxic contamination." The reporters surged forward, their cameras flashing. Mark was surrounded, trapped, and exposed. He tried to deny everything, but it was no use. The evidence was overwhelming. The reporters grilled him about the affair, the house, and the contamination. He squirmed, stammered, and sweated. He was a broken man. Sarah and I stood side by side, watching him crumble. We had finally gotten our revenge. The aftermath of the resort showdown was explosive. The story went viral, appearing on news websites, social media, and television programs around the world. Mark's reputation was ruined. He was fired from his job, ostracized by his friends and family, and subjected to public ridicule. The police investigation intensified. Mark was arrested and charged with fraud, forgery, and reckless endangerment. He faced a long prison sentence. The lawsuit was settled out of court. I got my house back, along with a significant amount of money in damages. Sarah and I became unlikely allies. We had both been victims of Mark's deceit, and we bonded over our shared experience. We even became friends. The environmental assessment confirmed that the house was indeed contaminated. The cleanup was expensive and time-consuming, but it was necessary. I wanted to make sure that the house was safe for me and for anyone who might live there in the future. I eventually sold the house. The memories were too painful. I needed a fresh start. I moved to a new city, started a new job, and began to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy. The betrayal had left deep scars, but I was determined to heal and to move on. I learned a lot from the experience. I learned that you can't always trust the people you love. I learned that you have to be your own advocate. And I learned that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, doesn't ultimately bring happiness. What brings happiness is justice, healing, and self-respect. Years passed. The scars of my marriage to Mark faded, though they never completely disappeared. I focused on my career, traveled the world, and surrounded myself with friends and family who loved and supported me. One day, I received a letter. It was from Mark. He was writing from prison. He apologized for everything he had done. He admitted that he had been selfish, greedy, and cruel. He said that he had finally realized the enormity of his mistakes, and that he was deeply sorry for the pain he had caused me. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew that he didn't deserve it. He just wanted me to know that he regretted his actions and that he hoped I could find peace. I read the letter, my heart filled with a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of pity. I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say, but I did realize that I had finally forgiven him, not for his sake but for my own. Holding on to anger and resentment was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I had to let go of the past in order to move forward. I never heard from Mark again. I don't know what happened to him after he was released from prison. I don't know if he ever found happiness, but I do know that I found happiness. I found it in my work, in my friendships, and in my own inner strength. I also found love again. His name is David. He's kind, compassionate, and supportive. He loves me for who I am, flaws and all. He knows about my past. He knows about Mark. And he doesn't judge me. He understands. We're planning to get married. We're going to build a life together. A life based on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. I learned a valuable lesson about due diligence. We made sure everything was in my name. Everything was checked. It might seem overkill, but the peace of mind is worth it. I often think about what happened with Mark. I wonder if I could have done anything differently. I wonder if I could have prevented the betrayal, but I know that I can't change the past. All I can do is learn from it. And I have learned. I have learned that you can survive even the most devastating experiences. I have learned that you can find strength in adversity. And I have learned that you can create a new beginning even after the most painful endings. I am no longer defined by what happened to me. I am defined by how I chose to respond. I am a survivor. I am a fighter. I am a woman who has learned to trust her instincts, to stand up for herself, and to never, ever give up. And that, more than anything, is Mark's greatest loss. He thought he had destroyed me, but he only made me stronger. Looking back, the entire ordeal, as horrific as it was, taught me some invaluable lessons. It wasn't just about surviving betrayal and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. It was about self-discovery and empowerment. First, and perhaps most importantly, it taught me the importance of trusting my gut. There were red flags early on that I chose to ignore, dismissing them as stress or simply going through a phase. If I had listened to my intuition, I might have uncovered Mark's deception sooner and prevented some of the heartache. Second, it taught me the power of resilience. There were moments when I felt like I was drowning in despair, convinced that my life was over, but I refused to give up. I channeled my anger and pain into action, fighting for justice and ultimately rebuilding my life from the ashes. Third, it taught me the value of female friendships. Sarah and I started as adversaries, but we ended up forging an unbreakable bond. We supported each other through the darkest of times, reminding each other of our strength and worth. Fourth, it taught me that forgiveness is not about condoning the actions of others, but about liberating yourself from the burden of anger and resentment. Forgiving Mark didn't mean that I excused his behavior, but it did mean that I was finally able to let go of the pain and move on with my life. Finally, it taught me that happiness is not something you find, but something you create. It's not about waiting for someone else to make you happy, but about taking responsibility for your own well-being and pursuing your passions. I often wonder what Mark is doing now. Has he learned from his mistakes? Has he found redemption? I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. I've closed that chapter of my life and moved on to a brighter, more fulfilling future. I am now happily married to David, a man who cherishes and respects me. We have a beautiful home, a loving family, and a life filled with joy and laughter. And every day, I am grateful for the lessons I learned from the man who tried to destroy me, because in the end, he didn't break me. He made me, and I am stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. The irony is, by trying to take everything from me, Mark actually gave me something invaluable, the opportunity to discover my own strength and create a life that is truly my own. And for that, I am eternally grateful. He might think he got away with something, but in the end, he lost everything. Little did he know, his actions propelled me to a new, better life I never imagined for myself.